So sometimes I'm invited to meet with people, or sometimes people invite me to have meetings, to ask questions about my work because of the way I approach my work. I focus on the curricula aspect, and my goal is full integration in terms of creating a competitive curricula with by including the lived experiences and narratives of Black heritage in the United States, and Black heritage in general. And so sometimes I get invited for these meetings, and there occasionally where I have asked people to just go and read my articles, especially when the first time I had a meeting and realized I was just rehashing my work that I already published. And so I would refer my articles, and then this time I decided, I'm gonna have this meeting mostly because I was really curious about a framework that somebody put together that they used related to socio-emotional learning. And so it was interesting. I had a meeting and it went well, based on the goals that this individual had. But I asked permission, and this person was fine with me using the framework. It is published, it's public information, and I don't remember the authors' names, but I will try to put a link so that anybody can look at it. But one of the reasons I really wanted to see is I wanted to see the advances people were making about socio-emotional learning. But what I found really interesting about our meeting is that, it was interesting because this person was interested in my own self-efficacy about, or feelings of my own ability of socio-emotional learning. Not so much how I enact the socio-emotional learning based on a person's goal, which is okay because everybody does their own research. But I thought it's such a great opportunity to discuss the actual enactment and what that looks like. Because when I look at the whole framework, I realize that this framework embodies the work I do, right? When I look at all the various aspects. And I'm going to read some of these to you because I want to point out a couple of things that really trouble me with our society that really supports my perspective that if this was our goal from the top, then we would have it, but it's not our goal. I know that we have people working in it in pockets and different classrooms, but I have seen in particular one school that where the leader is making it a goal, and I see the difference. It does create a trusting environment, and so let me just share this. This published work has a wheel that has to do with socio-emotional learning. And in this publication, this research, it talks about anchor competencies that includes building trust in relationships, fostering self-reflection, fostering growth mindset, cultivate perseverance, create community, promote collaborative learning, and respond constructively across differences. And in each of these are further broken down. I'm only going to share one of them that's broken down. The one that says build trusting relationships is broken up into several parts, which is develop rapport, engage families, practice reciprocal vulnerability, employ trauma-informed practices. And so when you break these down further, I look back on my goals for transformative learning. That's how I think about my own teaching and my own pedagogy. The goal is transformation. Let me give you an example of something I've done to do that. So because I prepare elementary ed majors in science, I've had to attend to the socio-emotional aspects of things. And I had to attend to it without necessarily having time to read about what socio-emotional aspect is. One of the things that came up was when students went to observe teachers, the understandings they expressed in their reflections did not indicate that they learned exactly what I had hoped they had learned, and which is a different way of thinking about science, which is a different way to enact science by facilitating certain higher order thinking. And so this led me to make some decisions. And part of it was because I was homeschooling my son at the time, and I was involved with the homeschooling community. I decided that this was an opportunity. And so I decided to teach other people's kids and have my students observe me teaching them and interacting. And so this brought out the socio-emotional aspect in a lot of ways. And so let's look at this wheel. What did it bring out? Well, one, I was engaging families. And part of engaging families did involve and does involve building trusting relationships and practicing some type of reciprocal vulnerability. And that came up in several ways. It came up in the way I interacted with families, because this is part of my experience as well. I was homeschooling my son for similar reasons that they were, and so we ended up talking about it. I ended up talking to students about it and helping them understand what was happening. Now, for students, it was transformational in a lot of ways. So in the first year I did it, we had homeschoolers came to visit us at the campus, and we did work in the classrooms and the labs, and we did some online work. I do have to say it, I mean, students loved the interaction overall. It seemed a little resistant, and I think if I were to draw a conclusion, I think the difficulty came in where, homeschooling students are generally, in some ways, some of them are more independent, and they become independent learners. And so the facilitation is important. And I think that students are used to being in a school setting where, in some ways, they're a little bit more dependent upon, and then you have the teacher with a different role. In this case, well, depending on the class, the first time I did it in such a way where students experienced the science activities as learners, and where they first learned it, and then they became helped with facilitation as they observed me teach and interact. And so it really brought on a different role. This year I did it a little differently. And once, someone was honest with me and saying it was a little uncomfortable, it was a little different because, I was used to just being in a classroom. But overall, students loved it. They expressed how much they enjoyed it. And I think one of the expression of surprise I saw was generally students might think that, other kids aren't capable, or not think that, and this is not because they think that they're not capable overall. This is because they're not used to seeing students engage in that type of problem solving. This year I did it a little differently. I thought, let's approach it where both my pre-service teachers were learners alongside the little kids. Because one of the things I do talk about quite a bit is having students understand you don't have to know everything. But when you're facilitating learning and you're facilitating cognitive processes, you're facilitating a discovery in such a way that they don't have to know everything in science, because they're not science majors at all. So I did it in such a way that so they were both learners. So we did a couple activities. One we did was I had a kit with simple machines, and they were discovering, and whereas, sometimes an elementary ed major might resist exploring something on their own, I think it helped them to see just how hard the elementary students themselves, the homeschooling students, were just really engaged and were discovering and working really hard to figure things out. And so as a result of seeing that, I think it helped both the homeschooling parents and the students. So I had parents and teachers in my class, parents, students, and preparing students in my classroom. And so one of the feedback they gave was just how much their child enjoyed interacting. I remember there was a yell at the back of the room because they were doing snap circuits. And one of the homeschooler, I believe that she was a middle schooler, they got excited because they actually made a radio work. Which, because they took it to the next level, because this homeschooling child was really engaged and really into it. And so they worked hard at it together, and they worked as a team with the elementary ed majors, and then they made it work, and they were excited. So there was a lot of emotional connections. Became like almost, sometimes I think I describe it as an out-of-body experience to see the type of, what we're doing. One, it served the community. Two, it gives students a different understanding of their learners, positioning them differently. And at the same time, it allowed parents some parents were there observing. Most of the parents stayed. Sometimes, now and again, especially if the kid was a little bit older, elementary, kid might, the parent might leave and come back. But I'm in contact with the parents. But I describe this experience to say that if that is our goal, right? If we make these larger goals our goal, right? To work with the community, to work with all communities, to provide resources for these communities, then we'll have that. We won't be even having this discussion about, what are the little aspects and what goes into this wheel of socio-emotional learning. The problem becomes that oftentimes these communities are scrambling to make these things happen. Or scrambling for resources, because one of the things the homeschoolers reached out to me and said, hey, these other predominantly white universities are providing you supports for these others. Well, what about, they wanted to make sure that, because the university setting and the heritage of the university setting, that we could support them as well. And so, the historically black colleges and university, the fact that they were on campus learning was just an amazing experience for them. And for this year, for the first time, we did a science fair where we did an inquiry exploration. I made it optional. I made optional for both pre-service teachers as well as students. But some students, I heard, some of our pre-service teachers were really involved in working with the elementary ed majors. It became vested. It was different. But, there were a bunch of things that came up. So one of the things that came up in that session with the homeschoolers, the first year I did it, was students, the homeschooling students, elementary students, were arguing back and forth about the moon, or they were arguing back and forth with whatever activity I did. And so one question I asked my students, my undergraduate students, was, did they stop to ask students a question? In other words, so one of the things that came up last year working with homeschoolers was, elementary students were arguing back and forth about the moon, or about whatever activity we were facilitating, which type of rock it is. One of the questions I ended up asking my students was, well, did the elementary students stop and ask you for a correct answer? And he said no. Because they were purely content to be in modes of discovery, going back and forth, engaging with the information, figuring out how to label. They never stopped to say, can you please give me a correct answer? I want to know what the right answer is, which is something that happens quite a bit, and something I've been trying to steer my students away, not because the right answers are important, and not because they won't get the right answers. The issue is, it reminds me of what Dewey talks about. Oftentimes, we like to suspend thinking in place of a final answer, right? Because once we get the final answer, we can suspend any thinking or reflective critical thought and engagement in that process. And so this is one of the ways that I facilitate transformation. And I've done it also with my students. I taught high school biology for 16 years. And among that time, I taught environmental science, I taught chemistry. What else did I teach? I taught a couple other things. And so one of the things I did facilitate were long-term inquiry. I had a science fair for my students. And I'll talk about that another time, but I'm just going to give you the gist of it. I had a science fair that became popular, where students from the rest of the school would observe my students, and I got to see the socio-emotional aspect, where the following year, which is unusual for me because my biology course is not the course, then the class that students, I'm just really very down to business. Unless you like to work, you might not come by my office to hang out, okay? And so that following year, I can't forget, I had students all the way around coming to say hi and connecting, and it got to the point where we even decided to do something the year after, and this is why, when I applied for a NASA related project with exploring the moon and asteroids. And I did it 2 years in a row. The first year I did it with my students who were in my biology and then chemistry course, and who want to just continue doing, and engaging. So, there's a socio-emotional aspect, right? Because students are visiting you outside of the classroom to learn more, and that is not exactly a typical experience. Okay, so my goal is, if we have bigger goals for our students, then we do end up having those things. The problem is our goals are too small. And I want to say one other thing when it comes to those goals. I ended up ending the science fair that I had. And there are some things that came up because One, our school was a testing school and it was a tryout school. And my thinking was, well, let's see what happens when the test is required. Then, I'll see how to integrate teaching to the test. And that was really what I was working on. How can you facilitate inquiry as well as accomplish teaching to the test? But a couple things were happening too. That was the regular education classroom. It was not the honors. And we know the statistics and typically who ends up in honors and who ends up in general ed. And so it became an issue. It became an issue because there were the general population who were doing these amazing things. And of course, me as a teacher, a Black female teacher, I'm not the one who's going to be given the honors, which I'm happy with. As a matter of fact, I was glad I wasn't given the honors because I can do amazing things with any students, which I do repeatedly over and over again. But if your goal is different and you're an administrator and your goal is the goal is not, the goal is not minority students excelling. The goal is to maintain the status quo. The goal is to leave things as they are, then that becomes controversial. And unfortunately, it has. And around that time, I decided it's time to leave teaching. And so my whole point is, I'm glad we're talking about the socio-emotional aspect of learning. It's really important. But we need to talk about the bigger things that are happening in society that has led me to launch this podcast. The bigger things that are happening in society that lead us to not integrate this socio-emotional learning aspect in all our classrooms, that leave things the same. Okay, it's not because we don't have people on the ground, teachers who want to change, who are trying things out. It's not maintained because the bigger part of this goal is student success. And a bigger part of student success is them becoming successful citizens. And a bigger part of successful citizens, it would be all of our students who, including minorities, being successfully employed, successful financially. Could you imagine what that would mean? You'd like to think that everybody would be happy. Okay. And so I want to talk about how to integrate that. I'm not going to harp on that. And I'm not going to focus on your resentment, but I'm going to use this time to really reveal a lot of our internal motives that drive some of these processes forwards or backwards or whatever way you want to say it. Okay, so I want to end that way today and say that if our goal is student success, if our goal is success for all students as the bigger goal, we'll hit all of these social emotional learning, okay, the way we do for others for whom we're focusing on success. Okay, if you like this podcast, please like and please subscribe.